Good afternoon. Welcome back to the B&H event space. Today we're getting a fresh take on essential portrait gear, hosted by Sony and Mr. Fresh Take himself, Chris Orwig, joining us. Fresh takes, hot takes, we got it all here.
We got it. We got it. Yeah, and what and why do we need a fresh take on portrait gear, which is the question, right? But I think it's because portraiture photography it's changed, and so the old take it doesn't cut it anymore.
Not holding up. No, stale Doritos. We're biting into stale Doritos at this point.
Yes, yes. Yeah, we
Oh,
talked about that before we recorded of just like these experiences in life when you let's say reach into a bag of Doritos that have been left out on the counter for a month and you're hoping for that snap, but they're just chewy.
the sink. You don't want to feel your teeth sink in.
You don't. And I think in portrait too, we want this freshness to create portraits that are relevant, kind of contextual to today and a little bit future proof as well, and have that snap and that power. So anyway, that's why the title Fresh Take.
Dude, nobody sets the tone like you. Just like relevant. That word right there. Relevant. Throw out
Yes.
every other adjective and like relevant is it. Where
Yes.
we have to be relevant. No matter what we do, it's got to be relevant to where we're at. You know, the
We do. We
timeline
do.
of art and of portraiture and of photography.
Yeah, yeah. And I think as photographers, as we grow up and grow old and all these things, we kind of tend to hang on to stuff, that have been with us in the past. But what we have to do is always reinvent, right? Always be relevant, always be contextual to like what's happening, what's in the air, what matters. Who are we? I think we have to pay attention to ourselves, but also others. And um, maybe something that's coming to mind is like there's this one kid on our street that I used to always walk my kids to school, and I would ride a skateboard. And every time I would ride by him, I would give him a high five. And I saw him the other day, and he's like 18. He's like this man now. I haven't seen him, in like a decade. But I picture him as this little kid, but he's not a little kid anymore, right? And so I think in photography, we have these things which are like these little visions we have, like this is what it's like, and this is what we do. But meanwhile, the world's grown up and the analogy doesn't totally work, but kind of, and so that's, a lot of what I want to explore from a gear perspective, from a philosophical perspective, so that we can create awesome work and be excited about it um, and not be stale Doritos.
No stale yeah, no life touch. Or maybe I shouldn't. No school portraits, knees, hands on the knees, feet on the
Yes.
X,
Yes.
updating and staying. And I think, as we talked about before going live, Chris,
Yeah.
it's there's a lot of questions, sometimes more questions than answers. I'm looking to
Yes.
you viewers out there because Chris and I bounced this back and forth, and it was a lot of like,
Right.
well, what do you think? Well,
Yeah.
I don't know. And we kind of just like we do with a lot of things, we were
Yes.
talking each other through it. And
Yes.
I think sometimes the answer is finding out how much you don't know, and that helps get you closer to the right direction to finding that eventual answer. But viewers, we want to hear and
Yeah.
have you guys engaged today because there is going to be a lot of stuff. And I think it helps to have a collective sense of because a lot of stuff we're talking about is industry related. And the
Yeah.
industry is made up now more than ever, again, relevance. It's made up of a huge mix of genres and professionals, amateurs, hobbyists, and all of those things being co-equals, not one being better than the other.
Yeah.
It's different. We are in a very different climate than we used to be. So that's my little nugget of information to the viewers out there watching
Yeah.
live. We want to hear from you guys as we start this conversation and as Chris progresses. We'd love to hear your thoughts and hear, stuff that we bring up. If you have a question to the answer, throw it in.
Yeah.
Chris?
And we'll prime some of those. Why don't I show some slides and then what are you drinking there in your mug too, by the way? Is it
I
coffee or are we going?
every time I take a sip, I just hear Fred in my head saying, "I have another delicious thought." It's killing me. It's the only way to do it. Cafe Bustelo, best coffee there is.
Okay. Amazing. Amazing. All right. Well, why don't I go ahead, share and pull up slides and you let me know if we can see these okay.
Looking good.
Okay. So this is all about portrait gear, and first of all, first of all, I should say I love portraits. I love capturing different kinds, studios, outdoors, moments, people, family. It doesn't really matter. Portraiture to me is sort of endlessly fascinating, and I'm intrigued by it and doing it in different ways. And I want to lead or move to a slide with a lot of text here, but I think this is important, and this is where we could ask the audience too, like, why does portraiture matter? And here, I'm saying it matters because it transcends the surface, ventures into soul. We're in like soul territory, inner essence of who people are. It's a way we can listen, we can hold space for someone. In a world with a lot of noise, portraiture invites us to slow down, to notice, to connect. And at the end of the day, I think portraiture matters because people matter. And what we need to do when it comes to thinking about the craft of portraiture is think of it in a historical context and just a very rough overview, just picking random items. But a few thousand years ago, and then a more modern, and kind of thinking about how does this relate to where we are today and where we're going. And the context for portraits shifts. I feel like it shifts almost every 5 years or so. It's like, at least at this current rate of change, where it's like, okay, this is a new environment for what we're doing. This is a new scene. Music used to be, there was like decades of music, like the 70s and whatever, the 60s, 70s, the 80s music. But then I think music is changing faster than a decade now. Art is changing faster, definitely portraiture. So in today's climate, I kind of think of the portraits are these storytelling tools. They help brands connect with audiences emotionally. They build trust, and they help brands stay relevant in this visually driven world. So this is kind of hinging upon this idea of brand in portraiture, and you'll see why in just a second. But portraits of yesterday, and maybe I'll pause after this slide and we'll talk, Derek, but we're traditional. Often there could be a traditional portrait setting or sitting. There was a formality to it. There was a physicality to it. Often portraits were printed. And when I say yesterday, maybe I'm thinking 10, 15, 20, 30 years ago. They were limited. So if someone had their portrait made, it was like, wow, that's like a singular, interesting thing. That's the only image we have of this person. There was a lot of editorial use of portraits, a lot of magazine covers. Most of those magazines don't exist anymore. That's not necessarily the goal anymore. There were a lot of books, coffee table books. There was an era when that was a really big deal, and famous portrait photographers would put out coffee table books. That's becoming more and more rare. And portraits, I think, kind of thinking about what they were yesterday can help us think about what they are today. So let me stop sharing here, and we can open it up for questions if anyone has them, or Derek, if you have any thoughts. But just the question I think I have for the audience is, what was portraiture, maybe for you personally, 10, 15, 20 years ago? And then what is it today? We're kind of going to lean towards that, but first we're going backwards. So what was it for you? I mean, just let's have fun with it. Let's say 10 years ago, what was portraiture for you? What did it look like? What were you aspiring for?
You hit the nail on the head, again, when we talked, and now you're talking about these things that were relevant and benchmarks, I guess would be a good word to throw out.
Mm,
We photographers, we have benchmarks, we have goals,
right.
and tear sheets used to be a benchmark.
Yeah.
Magazine covers, we talked about album
Yes.
covers.
Yes.
Now, one thing that kind of a nuance to the conversation is this idea. I'm just going to throw out a very cliche term, classic, because we talked about portraits, those portraits that you first showed when up on the screen. Those to me are classic, will never be out of style. No matter, they're always relevant because they're
Right.
good and they're classic in this, again, cliche, timeless
Yeah.
way. That's how album covers are to me.
Right.
I'm dearly connected to music. I think it's the ultimate in getting two artists together to create one vision and one working with the other to create a visual for the music. And I think music and visual have such a
Mm.
interconnected way of marrying. So for me, album covers are in that classic, will always be relevant. They're always
Yeah.
near and dear to my heart.
Can I jump in there just for a
Yeah,
second too?
totally.
I think back, 10, 20 years ago, however many we want to go. Um, it used to be though that the album imagery I really associated with the songs. Now I listen to songs and I don't even know one, what the band looks like,
Mm,
two, what the album art looks like, because often it's like I'm in the car, my daughter's doing the playlist, and I'm like, oh, I love that song. But the sound and the visual aren't as connected as they were 10 years
mm,
ago versus 10 years ago or 20 years ago. Like for me, a band I liked was U2. I really liked the photographer Anton Corbin, but like, let's just say Joshua Tree or any of the albums. It was like those visuals and those songs were like one and the same. And that was
totally.
yesterday. That was a thing. That was a real era. That was epic. And you could really connect them. So I'm just kind of,
That's a
you
great
know,
point.
just kind of calling out that there was a thing, and you were trying to do that. Now it's still there, but it's not quite as strong of a connection.
No, it's not. And I think that's again like what we were talking about. Is there a thing? Is there a stronger connection? Do
Mm,
we do we have those key benchmarks? Do the benchmarks exist? What are the benchmarks? Have the goalposts moved? Because as you say it, it's like, yeah, yes, it's near and dear to me, but on a whole industry sense,
right.
it's like for me, Pink Floyd, it's like if I show you the cover of Dark Side of the Moon,
Yeah.
I hear the album playing.
Yes.
You
Yes.
show me any album that's big from today,
Yes.
and even if it's the big Taylor Swift is probably as big as it gets now.
Right.
You show even Taylor Swift, maybe Taylor Swift's a bad example because her fans know
Yeah.
everything about her, but
Yeah.
most people, you show them a Taylor Swift album cover and they don't hear the album playing as they see the visual,
Mm, mm.
which is, I
It's
think, what you're
true.
talking about, that connectivity between, you know, show me another Pink Floyd album cover, show me, any The Wall, and I
Yes.
hear that album playing, and it's like I can totally
Yes.
have distinctive memories based on visual representation of what the music is
Yes.
behind it. So yeah, for me, but getting back to your original question of what does portraiture look like, portraiture for me is where I'm at now. Now I tie portraiture into me as a person, which is again a
Mm.
dominating topic in our conversations, both on air and
Right.
off air.
Right.
My portraits now are a reflection of me, whereas my portraits used to be so caught up in being dynamic,
Mm.
and ultimately it was about aesthetics. And now it's more of, no, I want a portrait that is wears well over time and is
Mm.
maybe a little simpler. Chris and I were sharing some images earlier, and I shared a photographer that I really love her work, and it's very simple and classic. And I love that it's so well seen and so well
Mm.
photographed, and
Mm.
it doesn't need dynamic light.
Mm.
And I think if I'm talking in circles, let me know. But I think my portraiture now, where I am in my life now, simple, classic. I don't need to reinvent the wheel.
Mm.
That's what a portrait looks like for me today. Whereas it used to be like bells and whistles and
Mm.
lights behind and edge light, rim light, hair light, all this
Right.
stuff.
Right. 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 Which is interesting. I mean, even thinking through like how light has shifted, and there was an era in portrait photography where everyone was studying everyone else's stuff and lighting diagrams, and you're trying to replicate someone's certain certain way of lighting. And I guess what I'm kind of getting at is I mean, I'm just going to go to the 80s visuals in the 80s. We can picture like 80s photography or something, or different eras, and that we're in a new era, and that while maybe album art isn't as strong or magazine covers, I might argue that like still images for like TV shows are pretty strong. So when you're scrolling through Apple TV or Netflix or something, you're seeing a still image that you can see, let's say Ted Lasso, you see that and you're like, I know that show, like that's really connected to the show. 20 years ago, there was no still image connected to a show, right? It was just the show. We didn't have like a way to access a still photograph from an image or from a show. So there are lots of other ways, and that are big, but also now I feel like a million that are small. And it used to be there were like, like anything, there were like, five main ways, to do things. Now there's 500 ways to do things. So let me jump back to the thing, to the slides. Let's keep this going. And I just like intersecting or weaving back and forth between some visuals and some conversation. And today, I think portraits are ubiquitous. They're everywhere. They're a little bit ephemeral, meaning they're like here and then they're not here. So they come and go. I think they are used to really help humanize brands. So brands need really strong portraits that make them not seem like some mega company, but they're like human, they're relatable. There's a lot of portraits that are now related to product. So you're kind of telling the story of a product. Um, Portraits help create aesthetics, style, mood. And again, I'm leading into this idea of branding because I'm also, you can see here, I also have personal branding. All of us have a brand now. We're all communicating a story. And so, what is our own story, aesthetic, style, mood? Brand ambassadors, influencers, that's a huge part of portraiture now. It's actually, someone's likeness, someone's energy, someone's vibe, in imagery. And in this kind of imagery, some of them are A-plus portraits, some of them are lifestyle, some of them are BTS. So we have lots of layers. It's lots of ways to create portraits. Sometimes portraits are capturing cultural moments, and they also clarify connection. So you can see a portrait now, it's very frequent to see people together, or to see who was at this event. Oh, if this person's there, their portrait was at this event, they somehow are connected or associated with that. So with all of this, the question is, so what about gear? How does this then shape what gear we reach for? And I think there are a few things that are still true that haven't changed. There are others that have changed. First of all, the thing that hasn't changed is, if you have this is a portrait of my friend Brandon, but if you have a really big camera with a really huge lens, it's still intimidating. It was intimidated 20 years ago. It's still intimidating today. It's almost aggressive, and it's hard to create really good portraits with really long lenses and big imposing gear. In contrast, I think today more than ever are all these compact cameras. This is a one capture with the Sony. I'm going to talk about Sony gear because I'm a Sony ambassador, but the concepts here are applicable to whatever brand you work with. But and all brands have now more compact cameras as well as their bigger cameras, but the quality you can get from these is ridiculously good. And in addition, you kind of, the picture of me over there, I'm just kind of happy. I'm at the beach. I kind of have a little camera. It gives you a way to work where you're nimble. And that's different. That to be able to create, this was photographed in a parking lot in front of a white wall, to be able to create a photo like this just by walking around town with someone is new. And this is part of the new era of portraiture that we're in. So let me pause there again. And Derek, love to hear your thoughts, reflections on that.
Well, I'm going to bring in a comment that we had gotten
Yeah.
from earlier that I think, relevant to this entire conversation. Unfudged said Che Guevara, MLK, Malcolm X, JFK, political icons that I'm too young to have experienced. So I think of the iconic portraits of them.
Hmm.
That word iconic,
Yes.
icon, I want to introduce that, not avoiding the question, but I want to bounce that back to you, these
Yeah.
iconic images and
Yeah.
how this has been shaped over time.
Hmm.
What is iconic, because it kind of, just to bring that first conversation back, you know, the idea of an iconic portrait and
Mm,
the shelf life of
mm,
portraits has changed, or
right.
has it? I mean,
Yeah.
for an iconic
Yeah.
person, like I mean, if we talked about coffee table books earlier,
Right.
and hopefully I'm not sidebarring too far
Yeah.
off the path
Yeah.
here, but everyone has these, like, if I name certain celebrities, it's like David Bowie. I'm sure
Yeah.
a picture's going to pop into your head, an
Yeah.
iconic photo
Yeah.
of like David Bowie, and it's
Right.
like, okay, well, maybe there's, like, for me, it's like a Ziggy Stardust photo
Sure.
is going to be that's going to
Right.
pop in my head, and we have these iconic, Bob Dylan,
Yeah.
and you see image. I guarantee most of our viewers that are familiar with these artists
Right.
or from that era are having visions pop into their head. Now, if I were to say somebody from today who is a
Mm,
big public figure,
mm,
does that same,
mm.
does that, when I say their name, does it take place? I mean, LeBron
Right.
James, right? There's
Right.
huge name. We all know LeBron
Yeah.
James.
Yeah.
Everybody knows LeBron James.
Yeah.
And when I say LeBron James, do you think of an image of him?
Well, I just did, but it was like him sitting in a chair, on the side of the basketball court. Not an iconic portrait. It was like a moment, and then maybe he was concentrating or something.
Just a
So
moment.
it was just like a small moment.
But if I said Michael Jordan, there's
Yes.
any number of images that,
Very distinct, iconic, like image. Like, like I could draw that image and it's like graphically very, like I think those iconic images were graphically so strong. Do you know what I mean? Like there was like this strength, this permanence, a singularity, this like, yeah, where I think to the question, it's an amazing question, is are there still iconic photographs made? And I just, while you asked that question, I did a search of like iconic portraits 2025 and then iconic portraits 1991 or something. 1991 had all these different ones. 2025, it couldn't like figure it out. Like Google Images couldn't it was like,
where do we
what's
go with this?
iconic?
Give
It's
me
like,
more information.
yeah, yeah, totally.
404 error.
Yeah. And I think to the point, it just part of it, I imagine, is we have so many more images, right? And we need more images now because we have access to them. So with LeBron James or with whoever, we want the iconic image. Maybe he's on the cover of Time magazine, that for some reason. Let's say he's Person of the Year or something. Or let's say Taylor Swift, wasn't she Person of the Year? So there's that image. I can't even remember what it was, but there's all these other images. We have so many images, and we need like the A+ images. And I talked about this last time, but we need these really like singular images, but then we also need kind of these action moment, lifestyle, environmental photographs. Then we need these kind of like kind of quirky, weird, imperfect images. And then maybe we even need something else as well, right? So portrait isn't just one thing. It's like all these things. We need more
Yeah.
pieces of the puzzle, I feel like,
Well,
culturally.
and I think an important piece to add in here is an iconic image now is more about the moment. And this I think this is a huge selling point of, like, when we're talking about the differentiation between an iconic image then and now.
Yeah,
Donald Trump assassination attempt. Within the past year, that's probably
right.
one of the images that has
Sure,
created the most stir from a photography
sure.
perspective. It carried the
Yes,
most weight.
right,
Was it about the image? No, it was more about the moment. Like
right.
the image kind of took, it was like, okay, yes, it's about the
But
image,
it's a
but at
good
the same
photograph too.
time,
I mean,
it's
photographically,
yeah,
it's
exactly.
designed well and composed well.
Exactly. And it's like to take nothing away from the photograph for the moment, but without the moment, the happening. When we're talking about iconic images from the past, I'm
Yeah,
talking about, you know, hey, guy, lady, sit down here on a box. I'm going to take a photo of you with nothing happening. Just like, I came in for a headshot or I came in
right,
for a portrait.
right,
And
right.
that image is iconic because of,
Mm,
and this is where it brings it back to gear, I think, because it was how the portrait was made. It wasn't so much
mm,
about who that person was, it was how the portrait was made. It wasn't, yes, anybody with a camera can take an iconic photograph of, if you're in the right place at the right time and something happens that is like,
sure.
whoa, I
Yeah,
can't believe that
yeah,
just happened. But I'm talking Chris Orwig comes in, sits down. I take a picture of him in my studio, and people remember this image 60 years later
right.
on a regular Tuesday in March when nothing was going on because of how I took it, because of ultimately the essential portrait gear that I used to construct that image. That's the power for me. And I think going back to the gear portion of this whole conversation, gear has become a microcosm for everything you just talked about. We have so much stuff going on, way more pictures. Well, guess what? We have way more gear. Photographers, it was like you didn't used to have photographers. I mean, other than professional photographers, and even professional photographers didn't have a camera phone on their hip. They didn't
Yeah.
have all like the gear that we do now. It's like me, sometimes I'm so diluted in, okay, I have a camera here, I have a medium format, I have an APS-C sensor, I have a phone on me. I'm not as tapped in now. Now when I want to make a portrait, I really have to make an intentional decision. Like, what gear am I going to pull out?
Mhm.
Or am I over because I have this over here? And everybody now, especially like, look at how many of our viewers out there, how many of you guys have like 3, 4 camera bodies, 5, 6
Right.
lenses,
Right.
and how intimately are we connected to the gear that is what we then use to construct an iconic image?
Yes.
Am I rambling, Chris?
You're good,
Did
man.
I
There was
pour
a
out the
comment that
coffee and
came
fill
in.
it with
I'm going to
water?
connect it that said,
Yeah.
"What about Yousef Karsh and his Winston Churchill portrait, which is a very famous portrait?" And this singularity, iconic nature of that. And I think what you talked about was when you talked about what I heard you saying in my own, translating my own language was, we have lots of gear, we have lots of options, we have all this stuff. It's crazy. But back in the day, there was this singularity, this intention. And I think great iconic portraits come from this intentionality. Like they're like, I'm going to do something great here. Like the one, and I like the portrait, in the parking lot portrait. I knew that was going to be a good portrait. And so I like did everything I could do to connect and direct. And we'll talk about that in the next webinar. I paid attention to the light. I had my gear, my craft so honed that I had this intention where I'm like, this is going to be great. The Yousef Karsh portrait of Churchill was at a very tenuous time globally with all the war stuff that was happening, and the story of that, and it's famous, most people know it, but like he was smoking a cigar, and the photographer came up and he asked him to take his cigar out of his mouth for the portrait, and he wouldn't do it, and so he came up and he took the cigar out of his mouth, and he walked back to the camera and he took the picture. And so he was pissed. And that photo then became this sense of defiance and even anger and just this like powerful thing. But I guess there was a real intention, like the portrait, Karsh took a big risk. He had incredible deep intention. He knew the significance of this moment and he brought that to what he was doing. So he wasn't just like happy, snappy, like, let's do whatever. Should I do a video? Should I do my iPhone? Should I do this? He was like, I'm doing this thing. And I think a lot of those great portraits that we look at, paintings, photographs, they have this intention. And part of that is gear related, but part of it's like, what are we bringing to the gear? Just yesterday, I was doing a consulting thing for a company, and I was I was using an example of someone. I said, okay, let's say you're going to photograph your mom. Like, how would you do that? And she said, well, I would just use my phone. And it's so funny how just and phone go so together. Like, oh, it's just my phone. I'm like, what are you talking about? Like, if that's all you have, you got to bring everything you have to that thing, right? And you can use that with that intention. But if we're like, well, this can't, there's, I have version one of the lens. I just have version one. I don't have version two. So I'm just going to take a version one lens, or I just have my iPhone, or I just have my APS-C sensor, or I just have the, it's like, no, no, no. Like great iconic portraiture, great storytelling, I think is intention. I think that's a big part of it. And really tuning into gear because that's what we're talking about today, but like bringing that to gear and like not listening to the marketing hype about gear, like screw that, that doesn't matter. They're just selling cameras and they have to do that, and it's great, they tell us all the bells and whistles, but what we then have to do as artists and as photographers is say, okay, for me, what is the absolute best thing that I can use in this situation, and why and how? You know what I
Can I
mean?
stop you real quick and ask you a
Yeah.
question?
Yeah.
Do you have a camera or a setup
Hmm.
that if I said, Chris,
Yeah.
you have one photo, this is going to be the last photo
Yeah.
you're ever going to take,
Yeah.
and I want it to be really you, I want it to be
Yeah.
a picture that you really just feel good about,
Yeah.
and that's the only constrictions I give you.
Yeah.
Do you have, like, can you
Yeah.
name
Go to. Yeah. I
your
was looking
setup?
behind me to see if it was sitting there, but yeah, for me, Sony A7R5, the sensor, the image quality, the autofocus. We'll talk a little bit about that in a second, but just hands down, best camera I've ever used. And then the 85 GM2, hands down, best lens I've ever used. And then a fixed focal length because it requires me to engage by using my feet and to move and to be really, really connected. I think longer lenses where you're, or tele, where you're kind of zooming in, zooming out, um, it's a little more disconnected. So um, I'll use a surfing example. Maybe you'll like this. Maybe you won't. But in surfing, um, you almost always wear a leash on your surfboard. So basically, Velcro thing straps to your ankle, kind of a plastic type cord connects to your board. So when you fall, it doesn't get washed into the rocks or whatever. But there are times when you intentionally surf without a leash. And when you do that, you're committed to everything in a different way because surfboard costs basically $1,000. And if it gets hit on the rock, it's going to cost you 200 or 300 bucks to fix it. And it's just, and then you can't stay out there. So you don't want that to happen. And so you're committed. You're like, okay, this really, really matters. Even the way you drop into the wave, the way you turn, the way you kick out at the end of the wave. And so for me, a fixed focal length has that same kind of commitment. It's like I don't have a safety net. I don't have a leash if I fall. Like with a 24 to 70, which I love, I'll talk about that. I'm like, well, 24 didn't really work. Zoom 70. Oh, that does work. Like no problem. Like I'm like fine. So, and so if I had a commercial job, I would bring a 24 to 70 because that's like surfing with a leash. That's like a safety net. That's like cover some bases. But if I had something like purely from my heart and my soul, and like this is like this image really needs to matter. I mean, maybe another way to put it would be, um, someone really significant in my life, a family member I'm going to do a portrait of. I know this is the last time I'm going to see them before they're going to go overseas for 10 years or something. No question. R5, 85 version 2. And the last thing I'll say about that is this is obviously my answer. Your answer is going to be different. So is Johnny's, so is Sarah, so is whoever. The most important thing though is to have an answer and to realize what it is about this. And as I told my answer, it had nothing to do with like marketing. I mean, obviously you want something high quality and yes, all that thing, but it has something to do with resonance, I think, and resonance with how you see the world, how you engage, and what kind of portrait you're after, which I'll talk about with some slides later. But if you're after something iconic, there's certain gear that's going to help you more to that. If you're a little bit more BTS, there's certain gear. Or, 20 years ago, I had this good friend. I'll try to remove some of the details, but he lived somewhere where these two famous people went surfing. He dressed in camo. He got a 600 millimeter lens. He hid in the in the jungle, took photographs of them, and sold these images to People magazine for $25,000. So, old school paparazzi, which that stuff doesn't happen like that anymore. Thankfully, paparazzi is a whole nother weird thing to talk about. But the point being, like for that particular thing, he needed a particular kind of gear to execute what he was trying to do. Portraiture for me is the opposite of paparazzi, is the opposite of big lenses. It is opposite of being camouflaged. It is opposite of stealing kind of photographs. It's this collaborative moment. It's this magic. It's this connection. It's this soul to soul kind of thing. So the focal length for me, 85 is 2 arms length away. So I'm 1 arm's length. It would be just one more. I'd be this far away from, I was doing your portrait right here probably. And being able to be in someone's like physical space, I found to be really important. So that if I need to say something to you or ask you a question, like let's say I want to ask you about your son, if I have a 70 to 200 and I'm at 200, I would be like, hey, how was your son's day at school? You know, because you're so far away. Versus like, hey, you're like, how was your son's day at school? You're like, oh man, thanks for asking. And then we're kind of connecting. So this is a long-winded answer, but intention's really important, gear's really important, and figuring out for ourselves what makes us sing. So let me flip the question back on you, just to because I think it would be nice to have point counterpoint. You have one image, important person. You have a lot of gear at your disposal. What you open your bag or your drawer of stuff, what do you grab and why?
I have a Fujifilm GFX
Hmm.
100S with an adapted Minolta FD 35 millimeter f1.4 manual focus. And I really learned to re-fall in love with the process of manually focusing,
Hmm.
slowing down,
Mm.
and appreciating the larger sensor, the slowed down process, the appreciation for a shallow depth of field used correctly and not in a way of being gimmicky,
Hmm.
using that to enhance and fine tune the focus while also appreciating the nuances and imperfections of a razor thin depth of field,
Mm.
missing focus, having soft focus, having, even sometimes it's the way it has a harsh vignette that is natural because it's a 35 millimeter lens on, not covering a not quite medium format, but larger
Sure,
format
sure.
sensor
Yes, yes.
for all the people out there on the internet who you're not going to get me. I'm not going to deal in absolutes today. Um, and I feel like it's this whole conversation to me is it's finding, platform 9 3/4, I think it is from Harry
Yes,
Potter,
yes,
where it's
yeah.
like
I love it.
it's a weird place where gear matters, but it doesn't matter.
Yeah,
And you either get it or you don't. Or maybe the Matrix is another analogy we can throw
sure.
out. It's like, you know, do you see numbers and this falling, or like what do you see? And
Right.
for people who get it, like they see it, like they see all that and they're able to
Sure.
translate it. Like, and some people are caught, okay, well, platform 9 is here and platform 10 is there, but I don't see platform 9 3/4. But
Right.
for us, we see it. We see that the gear matters, but at the same time, it doesn't matter.
Right.
And we're
Right.
not a hypocrite. It's this fine line of gear, but other stuff. Like you said it
Yeah.
perfectly, heart and soul. It's like, yes, you're very defined about what it is about the gear, but at the same time, the gear, it matters, but it doesn't matter because the heart and soul matters,
Right.
but the gear matters, if that makes sense.
It does. And I think what you're getting at is there's a paradox in portraiture, in photography in particular, but portraiture, Yousef Karsh pulling the cigar out of his his mouth. Um, is that an authentic portrait? Well, yeah, but was it contrived? Well, yeah, but is it authentic? Yeah. Is it it's both, right? And so I think it is
Yes.
both. And bringing that to the gear conversation is really, really essential. I think in this new era we're in, to kind of say like, okay, well, how in this era are we going to use this gear? Let me share some slides so I can kind of talk a little bit more about that and think about kind of think about gear in this perspective of what it is we're doing. I work for a lot of great, amazing brands. I have a lot of great, amazing gear, and I can reach for this and for other stuff. And what it is for me when it comes to portraiture is really thinking about telling stories. And with camera bodies, there are so many different options now. This is just Sony stuff, but basically a bigger one and a smaller one. And with my camera body, one of the first things I'm thinking about, at least for me, is eye autofocus. I want it to focus. I mean, I like your manual focus idea, which is really cool. But for me, it's this like really like 10 out of 10 images, the eye sharp if I shoot it as shallow if possible. Sometimes the physical size of the camera matters. So sometimes I need a smaller camera just because I don't want to carry around a bigger one. And then the sensor quality, the images coming off of it. So for me, the A7CR and the the A7R5 are the two kind of camera bodies. And I bring these bodies around wherever I go on a boat in Costa Rica, up in the mountains, or whatever it is that when I'm trying to do. And when I'm photographing people, portraits are going to be captured kind of in different ways, in different contexts of different people. And what I mean by that is I'm trying to tell these different stories. And what I want to get at with the storytelling side of portraiture is that, like in cinematic approaches, there's kind of this wider approach, like a scene setting. There's sort of a normal, a little bit medium, and then there's an up close. And I think ultimately, if you want to be a relevant portrait photographer today, you need at least one lens that can do all three of these things. For me, that's a 24 to 70 focal length. Something that it covers your bases as far as going wide and going a little bit closer, so that with one lens, this is Toby Shinobi, a great photographer, you can capture something where you're kind of showing more of the scene, or I can then go all the way to 70, like the image on the right, and capture something up close. So the 24 to 70 allows you to tell these stories where you're showing environment and you're showing person and environment. And these are some recent yoga photos, or you're photographing perhaps at an event. You're photographing the bride and groom and family, or you're photographing with the same lens, a bride and groom way out on the cliffs, or you walk up close to them and now you're showing them up close, or you're doing more traditional on the left or more interesting on the right. Or if it's a band, you kind of get the band photo of the guys on location, or the guys performing, or the guys where we're filming a video. This was a still from that, or them on the beach later. And the 24 to 70, again, it's allowing the capacity to kind of tell story with space and place, and to do that in a way that the environment, the context really matters. Now, could you have a fixed, say, 35 to do this lens, or fixed 24? Definitely. But I found in my workflow that sometimes I need to go so quickly between environment and up close that I need one lens that I can turn to that does this environment stuff really well. Do I have like a fixed 35? Yes. Do I use that? Yes. But sometimes on shoots, I'm really looking for something that allows for me to show the scene and to get up close. And then I think, so in modern portraiture, we need something that allows us to talk about the story of a person and place, and some kind of focal length that allows you to do that. And in my opinion, one lens that can do all three of those things. Then next, I think every portrait photographer needs to be able to tell that iconic story where you're creating images in this really singular and elevated way, where there's an intensity, there is a connection, where the environment doesn't matter, but somehow we are drawn into who the person is in a really distinct way. Now, of course, the environment can matter. There's some environmental elements in some of these pictures, but the 85 has this capability of, I think, of like this really unique strength. It requires a slowing down. It requires a thoughtfulness. It requires of really doing the opposite of the 24 to 70. 24 to 70, you're like looking around, everything in the frame matters. But then in the 85, you're like, at least for me, the eyes matter. That's like all that matters. And I need to have the soul, the heart, the spirit, the essence come through photographing strangers, photographing a young actress, friend. It doesn't matter. And so that lens really affords that capacity to, I don't know, to express in a very unique and distinct way. So this is kind of getting to the end of my slides here, and then we'll jump back to talking. But kind of reiterating it is, for those listening, if you want to get good at portraiture and you're thinking about gear and you're thinking about, okay, well, what matters in today's context of portraiture? The question to ask is, what kind of stories would you like to tell? Because portraits essentially are a story. They could be a story for an individual client, like a bride, or for a brand or for a yoga teacher or for a small business or for a giant business. And with the storytelling that I've found I do, it requires this wide, this normal, and this tele kind of perspective. And so if I had two lenses, it would be one that's versatile, that covers a couple bases, and one that's fixed. And I'll end sharing my slides there. And the last thing I'll add to that is that what I have found, there are some shoots where I bring a lot of my gear, and I have way too many lenses and way too many cameras and all that. And then my image processing or image process, my photography process is almost cluttered. It becomes slow. It slows down in an awkward way. So in portraiture, too much gear is not a good thing. If you look at like the great portrait photographers out there and study them, and often they'll have like a single camera and lens, and that's it. And then you get this singular photograph, this iconic image. And you're like, how'd you do that? Well, it's because they weren't like, well, what about this? What about that? What about that? They're not going there. They're like so present. And so what I found is like carry less and you capture more, more as far as weight, more as significance. So finding a camera kit that allows you to do that is huge. And then last but not least, if you're stuck and you have something wrong, and you know I've talked about this before, you have the wrong lens, like one shoot I brought the wrong lens, or you only have your phone only. You're just like, yes, I only have my phone. I only have this lens. I am all in. I'm bringing everything I have to the table right now. So letting go of if only thinking. And I think that's another big problem with gear is we think, well, if only I had version 2 of the lens, if only I had, the newer version of this camera versus the old one. But it doesn't matter anymore. It's all good. All the gear is good. I don't think there's any gear out there that isn't good. you know. So, what are your reflections?
You said something that made me think of our conversation earlier today
Hmm.
about, there's a way to talk about this topic and without toxic positivity, putting an upspin on it. Because we can
Mm.
sit here and say, oh, everything's different and oh, damn social media and no, now we've too many
Right.
pictures and all this,
Right.
and you kind of stopped our conversation. You're just like, like there's a positive way to look at things. And when you were just saying like the phone, it made me think of it. And it's like, that is the whole idea of intentionality. Like, it pairs with some of my earliest advice I ever got from one of my first mentors. Shout out Kevin Alex if you're out there watching,
Hmm.
listening. This is something he said 20 years ago that still it's like, wow, this resonates with me.
Mm.
That, the difference between a professional photographer and an amateur photographer is that an amateur photographer can go out and take a good picture. A professional photographer goes out and they know they're going to take a good
Mm.
picture.
Mm.
There's nothing standing in their way. There's no just an iPhone.
Mm.
I'm getting the job done.
Mm.
And I think what you just made me think of, my reflection is how many times instead of focusing on the task or the goal or the intention, we focus on the void. We focus
Mm.
on what we don't have, or we focus instead of on the person in front of us on the lens that's in our bag. Well, maybe I should put the telephoto on. And that's why I like that pared down approach. That's
Mm.
why we prepare before. That's why when I'm going to do a photo shoot or anything, no matter what it is, I'm picking the brain until there's no more meat on the bone of the person that I'm photographing. What do you want? What is your vision? What do I need? The pieces that need to be in play for me to
Right.
execute your vision, to put my spin on it so that we are both happy.
Mm.
Again, bringing up album covers. Got an
Yeah.
album cover right here behind me
Yeah.
that is near and dear to my heart. And that's what it was. I used AI to make mock ups of
Mm.
color schematics. Do you like
Mm.
these colors? Do you like
Mm.
this palette?
Mm.
What is your vision? What don't you like about this?
Mm. Mm.
I like this palette. What don't you like about it? What is the feel of this? What is the feel you're going for? What do you want people to feel when they look at your album cover? These are all the questions that we need to ask. And the more I go along in life and in my career, I realize that we focus so heavily on answers when we
Hmm.
should be focusing on questions.
Hmm.
We don't ask enough questions, and the
Hmm.
questions ultimately lead us to the answers.
Hmm.
Was that too? Am
No,
I
that's
reaching,
really, I mean, I
man? Let me
think
know if I'm reaching, Orwig.
no, you're on it. I think the idea of, back to kind of these storytelling and telling the story, at least, kind of weaving it back into some of the stuff I was saying too, is storytelling the person and maybe the place or the singulariness of it. I think one of the things that makes a portrait great is there is a question. There is a mystery. I mean, if we go back, like look at art, like Mona Lisa, no one really knows. Like, is she smiling? Is she not smiling? Right. Um, and it's there isn't, and even all these iconic images that maybe we've been conjuring up as well, like there's kind of like this curiosity there. And so as a photographer coming into it with that same kind of curiosity, like I heard you saying with your album cover thing, where you're like, what about these colors, or what do they want, what do I what's, and what that curiosity does, I think it's like raises questions. you know and for me, it's kind of like, who is this person? What can I learn from this person? Why is the universe, why am I crossing paths with this person? Like, what's there? What's the, and then what story do I want to tell? Like, I remember early on I had been pursuing photographing my surf heroes, and there's someone I photographed, and I was talking to someone. They said, well, can I see the photo? I was like, sure. And they were like, oh my gosh, I thought you were going to show me a photo of like a surf star. I didn't think you were going to show me a photo of his soul. Like, he thought I was going to see the same like a hero. Like, and I intentionally was like, I'm not photographing these people as heroes. I'm photographing them as like complex people with fears and dreams and all the things. Because we've seen those other photos too many times. And so I think the whole idea of question even is like, well, how should I photograph this person? Let's just say someone beautiful. Like, should I make this beautiful? That's not always the right answer, right? Maybe the right answer is I should make this kind of melancholy because they just lost someone important in their life. And what the real story here is loss and grief and love. And there's a tender side to that. So maybe rather than beauty being the goal, it's tenderness and thoughtfulness. And so asking those questions versus just being like, well, I'm going to go do this thing. And I think from the gear perspective, finding gear that helps you be inquisitive and curious. So, and basically, maybe if you had to choose like a wide, and then let's say if I had to choose, it might be a 24 and an 85. I would just have those two. The 24 is kind of like, like what matters in the scene? You're sort of, for me, it kind of makes me like look around because when I look at someone, I just so dial into their eyes and the person. That 24 is kind of like, yeah, okay, Chris, like what's going on? Okay, so that's a curiosity. When I put on the 85 lens, it's so zeroed in that I'm like, oh my gosh, this is like a special, magical moment to get to engage with someone. So finding gear that allows you to do that, and then having mastery of the gear is incredibly important. So the gear disappears. And so you talked about kind of your process and your gear. I talked about mine. It doesn't matter what gear it is, but if you're fumbling with it, doesn't matter how expensive, how nice, how vintage, how new, whatever. If you don't have that mastery, then I think the fleeting moment of the portrait almost disappears. Like you miss it. You lose it. You are distracted away from it. And so part of the gear, of course, is finding gear that you feel really comfortable with. and feels at home. So like when because I do a lot of coaching and stuff for people, I'm always like, well, just like pick up the camera. Like, how does it feel in your hand? Like, how do you like the menus? How do you hold it to your eye? Because sometimes smaller cameras will have like a viewfinder in a different spot. Like, does that bother you? Do you like that? Do you not like that? Um, and do you know how to change these kind of settings? Do you know how to, we know the drill, but um, that's a huge part of gear and intention and portraiture, which I think is different than, let's say, like a landscape, because you could take like 5 minutes to figure it out, and that's okay. Um, or you're photographing, I don't know, flowers or dogs or something. But in portraiture, there's like this, you kind of build this connection with someone, and there's this like this moment where the connection is right for the image, and then this is almost an arc to a portrait shoot. Like you meet and greet, it's a little bit awkward, you connect deeply, you create the portrait, and then it ends. It's kind of like going to coffee with a friend. Like you say, hey, what's up? You talk about really cool stuff, then the coffee's done, and you're like, I'll see you later. But if you're not tuned in to that, like I've seen too many students like trying to get the photo when the person's like ready to leave, and you're like, oh, or they're, you know what I mean? You're like,
They missed
the
the open
moments
portal.
you missed it, you know? I mean, like you could try, like, well, hey, just maybe, you know, they're like, no, it's done. So with the gear, finding gear that allows you to tell a story based on the story you want to tell that's relevant today, and the mastery of the gear. And then, of course, next time we'll talk about how do you actually connect with the subjects? Because the goal of the series is to kind of help people go from zero to hero. Like, how do we really do this from all these different perspectives? Now, with gear, if you don't have the gear, that's fine. If this has triggered thoughts of gear, you know, figure out how to get it and set a goal for it. You know, it's not like something um, impossible to do. And I know a lot of my gear, like there's one lens I still really want to get, 16 to 35 version 2, and I've been saving up for it for a couple years, and I'll save up for it and eventually I'll get it. So the point is like, don't let this prevent or stop your photographic flow. Use what you have, use it well. And then if you decide you need to shift and change, save up and pull it off. You know, it's worth it. Portraits are worth it. People are worth it.
Totally. And that's such a great just entire point that you bring up about the gear and intentionality and know what your gear does. You know, and
Yeah.
that's where the technical aspect comes in too. And I think this is more geared towards beginners or newer photographers. And I think this is a conversation that can help shape your process, your growing, your learning, because we all go through that stage when we're starting out of like, well, what lens do I want? What
Mm,
lens is right for me? And you go through all these lenses. You think you want this, you use it for 6 months, and then you're over it, or you get it, you don't use it at all in 6 months, and you realize that okay, looked better on paper. And I think when you really break it down to a molecular level of what does this lens do? Not what is it right for? Is it right? Because I used to shoot a ton of portraits at 24 millimeters. And, you know, it's not a portrait lens, but I loved the look of it. And
mm,
it had nothing to do with the lens. It had to do with what was I going for? I wanted
mm,
proximity. I wanted to get close. I
mm,
wanted to be so uncomfortably close to my subjects that it exuded whatever they were going to show, whether it's comfortability or whether it was nervousness. I wanted that to come through. And there's no better way to get that to come through than to literally be this close to them.
mm.
Right. So it wasn't about, well, this is a good portrait lens or this is good in low light. It had nothing to do
Right.
with that. It had to do with the physics of the lens and the physical proximity to the subject that that lens forced me to embrace. So when talking about gear in this sense, again, ask yourself questions. What am I really looking for?
Yeah.
Storyboard out your thoughts, your feelings. Look at images you like. Tear images out of these magazines that Chris and I have already established no longer exist, and they're not in airports anymore. They're not
Right.
hanging out by the cash register in
Right.
grocery
Right.
stores. Go online. I think that we're so old, Chris. Go
Yeah.
on
Yeah.
Pinterest. Go online. Create. You know, if you have a Mac and they have this wonderful app on here, Freeform, where I can just drag stuff and drop pictures, and it's like this like ever expanding
Mm,
kind of cork board for me to just drop stuff on there, really pay attention to what you like and what moves you, and then break it down. Okay, well, I love the fact that this is really environmental and it has all this stuff and it kind of looks like, it's all, a vortex pulling stuff into the center. Okay, well, maybe they shot it on a really wide lens
Mm.
and use that wide lens to enhance your vision. And I think that's where we get into the idea of intentionality and gear, the intersection of gear and intentionality. What
Mm.
is it about the gear? Don't get caught up in the numbers. Don't get caught. This is best optically. Throw
Yeah.
all that stuff out. What
Yeah.
does it do? Is there a shallow depth of field? Why do you need a shallow depth of field? Do you need a shallow depth of field?
Right.
What look are you going for? And how is that look being enhanced by the gear that you're choosing? And then how are you taking that gear, that look, and applying it to your subjects?
Yeah. And I would even say look or feeling.
Feeling.
I mean, I think that might, it's two sides, right? Because you
Yeah.
have to have like there is a actual look that lenses provide, like you said, the wide and that I have another friend who does a lot of portraits, a wide angle lens up close like that, subjects in the center. And it's this kind of neat, intimate, little bit eerie and weird, but like really neat, intimate portraits. But so that's the look. But then for me, which I like, but the feeling I don't like, maybe the eeriness of it, because I like
Interesting.
warm. And so yes, um,
I love that. Look is
making
tethered
sure,
to feeling.
yeah, look and feeling because we're it's, and I think a lot of those things have done such a good job, Pinterest and different things. And like my sister and her husband are building a home. So they have like these mood boards of colors and textures and and that's all feeling stuff, right? It's like,
Mm.
how do they want their home to feel when you walk into it? And you need some you need some visuals to kind of help establish the feeling, right? And so I think in portraiture, same thing. Like, what is it about this? And then above and beyond that, we need to also ask, like, well, what does window light convey? What kind of feeling is that versus, um, maybe a shoot through umbrella right overhead, straight down on a subject, a little more intensity. It's a little more shocking almost. So the feeling's a little more jolt. There's a little more jolt to it versus like, a little bit more soft. So it's not just those, both of those have a look, but they also have a feeling. And then asking ourselves as photographers, well, what feeling, what do I value? And then to your point earlier, also client or subject, if we know, what do they want as well? Like if someone came to photograph me and they were like, I really like kind of like soft. I really want it to be kind of soft and feminine and kind of like, and like mystical. I would be like, I'm not really, I'm not really into that. You know what I mean? Um, so then they would need to kind of work with me. I'm like, what do you mean by soft and feminine? Like, and I'm just venting up some random dumb idea, but I have been photographed by many different people. I always ask my friends to photograph me who are talented photographers to experience it. And many of them have used their own vision to photograph me, and I don't like the images of myself. They like the images, but I don't. And that has been an important lesson for me to not have such a strong vision that I'm kind of steamrolling what they may
Mm.
want, which you talked about with your album cover. And often where that comes from, and we can talk about this next time too, but it's like, I'll ask them, I'll say like, hey, what kind of images do you need? Like, I forgot to ask, like, here's what I'm thinking, but what do you need? And often they'll have great ideas for that. Now, if it's a stranger or if it's an event or something, that question isn't relevant, right? It's just like you have to go with your gut. But in other situations, doing that, and then if they were to say, well, I really want something where it's like I'm in this field and I'm super small and their sky is big, then I'm like, oh, I got to go grab my 16, 16 and 35, even though I had a vision of 24 to 70. 24 isn't wide enough to get that look. So I need the 16. I want the real thing because they said that. And that could be a cool portrait. So yeah, I love how you're talking about this idea of looking at things. And back 20 years ago, we used to look at photo books. Everyone would buy, at least I did. I had all these coffee
Mhm.
table books. I would lay them out. I would study them. Um, and the reason why I want to go back to that is finding a way to look at something, but don't think of it quantitatively, but qualitatively. So you don't need to have like 100 photos you like, like if I were coaching someone, I'd be like, give me three. Like let's look at 3 to 5. Let's talk about why this is. Let's really get to know this. And often a student will say, well, I like this. And I'm like, why? They're like, I don't know. And I'm like, okay, well, it's like, if you just give me something, you know,
How many times
and
do people do that? In
what's that?
every
How?
how many times do we do that? Like
Yeah.
social medias, we're liking. We're not going through and like, well, in order to click like, you have to tell me what you like about this.
Yes. Imagine if you did, like, if you had to like pause, like, and you're like, well, what I like about this is there's this cool mood and the light's raking through the side and it's not overdone. And yeah, or that would be really interesting. Like, who knows how social media will evolve, but like if every time you liked it, maybe your phone would like turn off for 5 seconds. So if you were to click a like, it would go black and you'd be like, ooh, do I really want my phone to go black right now? Or, but so we, that would be kind of a fun version of Instagram.
I
You're
would
like,
I would I would just stop liking everything.
I would stop liking it
Keep
too.
the
I would
doom
be like,
scroll alive.
yeah, totally. Yeah. I think people are going to, everyone's trying to figure out how to stop doom scrolling, right? It's a funny thing. But as artists, as creatives, having the pause, asking yourself why, finding some way to do that, whether it's a print, whether it's creating a little board, mood, super huge. And then back to the gear, because that's what this is about, is exploring what gear would help you get there. And probably the answer is more than one thing. And so that could be like I'm doing this thing with this guy right now, coaching him. He basically is a high net worth kind of person. And so he's basically like, I want to get the best setup possible, And so I'm like, all right, it's kind of easy. So you can imagine what I told him, 24/7, whatever. And then he also got a film camera. He's never shot with a film camera before. And so we got a film camera. And so, because that's going to be more of that slow analog process. And then we have the digital process. And we're going to talk about storytelling in the different ways and different pros and cons and all those kind of things. But the reason I'm bringing that up is to just come to terms with this idea that there's not a like magic bullet, and that but there is less can be more. Like with this guy who can buy everything, his kit's gonna fit in this little teeny backpack. And I could have told him to buy like 50 lenses, and he would have bought 50 lenses, right? Or not, whatever. He would have told him whatever I wanted. But to really get good at it, we need to start small and focused with a couple core elements that will allow to express based on what he said he wants to learn, he wants to do, and that will allow us to do that in a good way. So
Great conversation, as always.
yeah, so
You
fun,
opened
man.
my mind up, and
Likewise, man.
it's like the creativity, and I hope all you guys out there really are soaking in what Chris drops on us every time he comes on, because it really does. I think, we always joke that you're the event space therapist, but it's like, dude,
Yeah.
like you open up that part of my brain that makes
Mhm.
me dig in. Like, am I really getting anything out of my work? Is my
Yeah.
work moving the needle? We maybe we'll jump more on it next week, because we had an
Yeah.
interesting conversation earlier about like what is the new magazine cover, like, and we
Yes.
touched a little bit
Yes.
upon, but I think we dove into such a interesting dynamic this morning about like, you know how much it moves us when someone uses an image as a profile
Hmm.
picture. Like,
Right.
that's where we're
Right.
at now, where it's like, that's kind of cool to see that someone took my
Yes.
vision of them, and that's the
Yes.
vision they want reflected out to their world,
Yes.
and how that's kind of shaped the entire photo landscape of, the benchmarks have changed and the goalposts
Yes.
might have changed. I think that's kind of a cool dynamic to look at. So, I hope you guys are out
Yeah.
there. Ask yourself the questions. Listen when Chris has these conversations with us, take it in. I mean, really sit there, pause, take a moment to let this all kind of marinate, and take that back to your own work and apply it. Well, I'm going to throw one last
Yeah.
question in there for you, Chris,
Let's
if I
do it.
can.
Heck
Got
yeah.
Unfudge here chiming in. Would you have a totally different setup if you were doing portraiture at night?
Hmm. I think at night, I mean, it would be great. I would ask again, like, what kind of at night? Are we talking like a fisherman down in the harbor or something like that?
Does night make sense?
Yeah.
Let's see how
Well,
well I know Chris. Does night make sense for the photo? Does it need to be at night? Does the night,
yeah.
what does the
Well, I'm
night
just gonna
add?
picture like I did one. It was in the morning before sunrise, so it wasn't night, but it was like a fisherman by his boat, and he's like beautiful. It's really dark out, but he was, I love that photo. So I used 2470 for that. So yeah, I would use the same setup. So or if it was late at night on a city street, so I would do something wide to tell the story of a scene because otherwise there's just so much darkness, I would think. If I were to do my up close work, it would be almost like the skin would be too bright compared to the environment. So I'd want something where I could balance out the two a little bit. But yeah, I think that's a fun question and thinking through like one, when and where do you like to capture photographs? This affects your gear. What stories do you want to tell? Do you want to tell like night stories? Like, cool, okay. Like, well then how confined is the space? Is it indoors? Like, do you have enough space to back up? Like my little cabin, I would need, 24 might not be wide enough. I might need a 16 to 35 to get an environmental portrait in here. So kind of thinking through that and then ultimately the feeling which I was getting at with it night portrait of like the up close face of the fisherman, you'd just be like, wow, there's like a really harsh light on his face and everything else is black. So I don't like that feeling of harshness, but I like the idea of story, a fisherman by boat, um, down at the harbor. So so it's a cool question and thinking through where you're going to do that and then maybe thinking of another one of my coaching clients, has some physical limitations. So she uses a really lightweight small camera with a lightweight small lens because she just can't hang it off her shoulder and walk around because it's kind of a burden. So if she's going to travel and do walkabout photos, we kind of came up with a kit that she can handle and carry and bring around out in places. So that also is going to affect the gear choice as well, right? And even for me, if I'm going to walk around a little market, I'm not going to bring my 85 and, you know, do these intense up close portraits. It's just too much camera and lens in like a public setting that would make people like not feel unsettled. So anyway, great question in the sense of like, think about your context. And then Derek, you also talked about, think about like, where is the image going to end up? How is it going to be used? And maybe we'll talk about that more later. But that's really important too. That affects our gear choices and kind of what are we striving for? And then what we're striving for, um, it doesn't exist. It's photography has changed. And so we have to kind of almost up level our desire to match the current world, which is like for me, I haven't had my images published in a magazine. I I I can't even remember. Like I have magazines like that I've saved for my stuff, but maybe it's like they're 10 years old or something, 5 years old. I don't know how old they are. Um, so if I'm not going to do that, what am I going to do? What are the benchmarks to your point, and how are these used and where are they used? I should say too, I've had stuff published in magazines that clients have published, but I don't ever really see that versus more editorial work. A lot of the editorial stuff's dried up. Um, but rather than it editorially being in a magazine, now it's maybe on that person's feed or that brand uses it on social. And so that's now the new climate. So where it goes affects the way it's captured,
Yeah, I
right?
love it. And that kind of was a great question to kind of tie this whole
Hmm.
conversation up because it incorporates everything. It incorporates asking questions,
Yes.
having intention, gear in the terms of limitations where, you know, all the questions you ask lead to the gear. The
Yes.
intention leads to the gear. It leads to more questions.
Yes.
Like you were saying. It's like, well, does it have to be at night? I love
Right.
how you answered that question. Your first response out of that was basically a question. Well, okay, at night. Well, does it have to be at night? What's like
Right.
why are we talking about at night? Does the
Right.
night, what about the night tells a story? Does it tell a story? Does it have to, do this? And I think that's where, going back to the surfer portrait, that's going to be another one of those things that sticks up here that I'm always going to remember, in a way of constantly learning from those around me. In that, that's so awesome that rather than seeing a hero shot and seeing that cliche magazine editorial, they felt it. They felt the
Right.
photo.
Right.
And I think that's such a cool way to kind of put it in there. Create an image that someone feels. Don't create an image that looks like the magazine cover shot is dead. I'm gonna say
It's
it.
dead. It's
It's
dead.
dead.
It's dead. And yes, there's still Time magazine that will have cover photos. And yes, but the reality of, uh, I don't know, let's say there's 10, 15 photographers in the world, they're going to do those, and the rest of us are going to do other stuff. So unless you want to get there, let it be dead. You know what I mean? Like move on. Like it's
Move
okay.
on.
There's other
Yes.
ways to get quote published and get your work out there and create meaning and ultimately back to the beginning that all this portraiture stuff matters not because a magazine with high circulation is going to put it on its cover but what matters is that these people matter and our experience with people matter and we have the ability to kind of share with the world that and I think this time more than ever that people really really matter and to help us kind of correct course a little bit and create some cohesiveness in humanity. I feel like that's what portraits do, at least for me. I feel less alone. I feel more connected globally. I feel more connected to people of different ages, genders, political points of view. I feel like it gives me understanding, wisdom. It's a way to honor people, to see people, to be seen, to listen, to the whole thing. So I think ultimately this kind of work really matters. I mean, I would also say other kind of work matters, like someone who's photographing flowers. Flowers matter. They're beautiful. We need to be reminded of beauty, right? But in my case, it's people. And so my thinking with all of this is just that the effort in gear, figuring out your gear, asking the questions, which I love how you're highlighting that it really matters and it can make a difference in your life, enrich your life in like huge ways. It can make a difference in other people's life and maybe even like in the world. I think
Okay.
I think back to the iconic photos. There is potential for portraits still to have a really big reach and impact us. I think the reach is now more grassroots than it is like up on a stage, but it's out there. So it's cool
Yeah.
stuff.
And last thought, I'll leave it here, is just because it might not have worldly impact or far reach, if it means something to you and gives you reason to pick the camera up again and
Yeah.
again and again, that's all the reason you need. So find
Yeah.
your reason, like you said, find your reason, find your purpose. Whether it's portraits, whether it's flowers, why do you pick up a camera? Why do you create? And that's it. We'll leave it there.
Yeah.
Chris is
And
going to be
well, I'm going
back.
to add one more thing.
Yeah,
It's
go
like
for it.
I work with people who have struggled with deep depression and they're using portraiture in particular as a modality for healing because it gets them out, gets them to engage with people, helps that they're photographing people who they have made an impact on their life. So they're going through their life history and but it can provide healing too. So I think there's a chance that this can just be fun, but there's also a chance that it can be good for the soul, wherever you're at. So I think that's a great ending point here. And then next time we'll talk about how do you actually connect with people and make that connection so that that shows up in the frame. So more to follow.
Love it. Can't wait for next week.
Likewise.
Always good conversations, man. A huge thank you to you again for
Yes.
another
You too.
burst of inspiration that you throw out into the ether for us and all of our viewers out there. We hope you guys enjoyed this. We hope you come back and enjoy and join us for the next conversation we're going to have next week. And huge thank you, of course, to Sony for hosting this wonderful event with Chris. And that's it. That's all we got for you for right now. Another edition of the B&H Event Space now in the books. Go create something. We'll catch you
Ooh.
next time.